Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to the first session of our global webinar series 2024 on the theme Key Considerations in the Energy Transition, a spotlight on infrastructure, gender, and governance. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are. I see that we're nearly at 150 people, so it's a great pleasure to have you all here. I'm going to start with introducing myself. My name is Sadhika Shashi Prabhu, and I work with the United Nations Environment Programme in the Disasters and Conflicts branch based in Geneva, Switzerland. I'm a legal analyst under the partnership between UNEP and the Government of Norway. The primary objective of this collaboration is strengthening national capacities to reduce environmental and pollution risks associated with the oil and gas sector. Our work now increasingly looks at promoting dialogue on the energy transition, especially with a focus on social, environmental, and governance aspects of the transition. Our work involves delivering technical assistance and training to countries, as well as undertaking global outreach activities that address environmental safeguards in the energy sector. Our annual global webinar series aims to spread awareness and encourages multi-stakeholder dialogues about the latest developments in the energy sector. Given the growing global consensus to phase out fossil fuel dependency, and with COP28 laying the groundwork for a just and equitable transition, this year our webinar series is focused on the energy transition and the enabling conditions, including social and environmental considerations. So our first session today is called Building Blocks, the role of infrastructure in facilitating the energy transition. It will look at repurposing oil and gas infrastructure, for instance, using existing wells and pipelines for new renewable energy projects. We will examine how the shift from brown to green infrastructure is spurring sustainable innovation, is a cost-efficient alternative to dismantling, and facilitates a circular economy. For countries which are in the nascent stages of ramping up investments in renewable energy development, our expert from GetInvest will guide us on establishing baseline infrastructural systems that encourage and facilitate renewable energy development, as both electrification and new renewable sources require an unprecedented commitment to upgrade and build infrastructure. The conversation will include discussions on mini-grids, solar home systems, and independent power producers, particularly the environmental and social aspects of these processes, using case studies where possible. Before we begin, I wanted to go over some basic logistics of the GoToWebinar platform. Please remember that this is a recorded webinar and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. We encourage audience participation and ask you to send all your questions and queries into the chat box. We will try and answer as many of them during the Q&A session, so feel free to type in. We will, however, not be able to give you the floor given the time constraints, but please write in your questions. You will also receive a certificate of participation if you stay with us until the end and fill our evaluation form. Now, at the end of the webinar, you will get an email which includes a recording of the webinar, all the slides that have been used today, as well as the bios of the speakers that are speaking. Without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Kevin Crozier. Kevin is the CEO and co-founder at Avatar Innovations. He has spent 25 years on the front lines of the energy innovation in numerous executive leadership roles across the industry. Previously as the chief executive of Canada's oldest drilling company, in the midst of the pandemic, he began Canada's first energy technology venture, studio backed by some of the largest energy companies in the world, called Avatar Innovations. Kevin is uniquely positioned to lead Avatar Innovations' ambitious plan to unlock energy transition solutions inside oil and gas from investment, commercialization, and scale. Kevin's leadership has led to the creation, financing, and execution of some of the first fully computerized drilling rigs in Canada, the first long-reach horizontal well in the Canadian Arctic, numerous joint ventures with Canada's Indigenous peoples fostering economic reconciliation in remote communities, and the creation of the Calgary Energy Transition Centre. Kevin holds a Bachelor of Science from McGill University and a Master's of Business Administration from the Haskayne School of Business. Welcome, Kevin. Thank you so much for being with us.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Kalka, for the kind introduction, and welcome everyone to this morning or this afternoon. Looking forward to this session. I hope to share with you some perspectives of what we're working on here in Canada, as well as in the United States, and operations that we're having in the role of the oil and gas industry in the energy transition, the complexity, the scale, as well as the opportunity in front of us. So first piece of the puzzle I wanted to sort of check in with is where are we at in the energy transition? 2020. Hold on, I'm just trying to move things around so I can see my slides. There we go. Okay, so 2024, where are we at in the energy transition? COP28, in my view, was one of the more foundational COPs that's ever had. I might even go so far as to suggest it's the first real COP, which I think might be a little controversial, but I will explain my thinking on that as well. There was a massive geopolitical and energy reality check that happened in 2023. In the sense that both, instability in the world around two major energy centers, as well as the realities of I think the scope and the scale and the complexity. But I think also too, 2023 is an undoubtedly year where we are starting to feel the second derivative of the exponential change. So as opposed to the speed that we're going, it is absolutely accelerating in an undeniable way. The energy transition is real, and it's undeniable. So against that sort of backdrop, I'll explain my thinking on, first of all, the first real COP. And why was that? And that was, in the sense, it was actually the first real COP where the oil and gas industry was invited in a meaningful capacity. It has historically been, the domain of governments as well as NGOs, leading to public policy implications. However, in terms of the actual oil and gas industry's participation, this was the first year, which resulted in the oil and gas decarbonization charter. You might say, okay, well, do we need another charter? But the thing that was most profound from the oil and gas decarbonization charter launched to COP28 was the fact that it included the national oil companies. 80% of global oil production comes from national oil companies, not from independent oil companies. So for independent oil companies to commit to net zero, you're only really covering a sort of small subset of it. And so that was a watershed, monumental moment, as well as the global methane pledge and fund, which is to sort of get to essentially near zero methane by 2030. In the sense that methane is, depending upon how you calculate it, up to 84 times as potent of a greenhouse gas emission as CO2. And it's an easy, quick, short win that we can accomplish as an industry to be able to sort of move forward with these initiatives, and alongside renewable pledges and industry transitional pledges, but then also the sort of watershed language around the first time around a transition away from fossil fuels, and we can discuss sort of what that means. But by and large, it resulted in, behind the scenes, significant industrial capital and pledges that are now in the works and underway with the oil and gas industry and the national oil companies leaning into the energy transition in the first real way. And it is exciting to see the work that has happened, not just at COP, but continuing along, which is catalyzing capital investments in a way that I've never seen sort of the oil and gas industry lean into the transition before. So I'm sure everyone is sort of aware of sort of that every energy decision has a challenge of being essentially balancing against a decision around the cost of the energy source, the sustainability of the energy source, and the security of the energy source. And every jurisdiction makes these balances, and solar even has sustainability concerns on the sourcing of locations of its supply chain. And so the goal ideally is to make that triangle as small as possible, but the only way you really do it is through innovation. And so the role of technology innovation inside the energy industry has never sort of been more critical as we go to deliver lower cost, higher security, and higher sustainable energy source. And the complexity of this is absolutely sort of massive. So thinking about that, you look at sort of, okay, how do new energy technologies sort of come to market? And this is the sort of, consistent, simplistic understanding of how the energy transition is going to happen, in the sense that you've got an incumbent energy source that is slowly getting more expensive, is getting regulated out, and then you've got a new source of energy that is coming online, driven by innovation and economies of scale. The cost of solar has dropped absolutely dramatically. In some cases, is now the sort of lowest cost of energy. But in the simplistic view, you get to this point, that's somehow always 3 to 5 years out, where sort of you have this inevitable flip, and we switch energy sources to the more sustainable one. The challenge is it doesn't ever work that way, because there's competitive responses inside the incumbent industries. And so as the price of solar has dropped dramatically, you get competitive responses from incumbent energy sources that internally lower their prices, try and maintain their market share. No incumbent of any technology in any market is just going to sit by and watch their challenges come out. So you're now, I think, starting to see these sort of competitive processes that are happening in a much more complex energy system as we move forward. And so here's really the challenge. Last year in 2023, we used more energy as a planet than we ever have before. And renewables still, sadly, are, less than 10% of the global energy mix. After years and years and trillions of dollars and massive public investments, the global energy mix is still 80% hydrocarbons, and we've been making only a 1 or 2 or 3% dent. A stat that I find actually kind of really fascinating is currently the world is using 80,000 terawatt hours of energy. And that is essentially the equivalent of every man, woman, and child on the planet running a toaster 24/7. That's not that much energy if you actually think about it, if that's the equivalent usage of energy. The challenge is the top billion of the planet uses an exorbitant amount more of energy. And as the developing world fills its voracious appetite for energy, we're not just completing a transition on an existing energy mix, we're completing a transition on an exploding energy mix, meaning the size, scale, complexity, and investment cost of the energy transition will be absolutely staggering. And in my view, we must take a technology agnostic view on the development of all technologies, of any technology that actually sort of reduces emissions. And so here we are. All of these things are buzzwords. This is an analysis that was done by Thunderset Energy. If you're not familiar with it, I think it's one of the smartest energy research firms in the world. But the point I'm trying to make is if you stack up all of the technologies that are sort of available, you look at the ones that are sort of currently available and currently deployed. I think if you look at LED light bulbs, on the cost per ton of CO2 abatement, it's actually almost a positive number. In the sense, you take a existing incandescent light bulb which is at best 1 or 2% efficient, and you go and replace it with an LED light bulb that is 40 to 60% efficient. You're saving not just money, you're also abating CO2. And the technology now, at least in North America, it's hard to find an incandescent light bulb anywhere more. And that's how the technology implications of the energy transition are going to happen. when you can come up with a higher utility, lower cost energy source or energy technology, such as an LED light bulb, it scales absolutely massively and rapidly and quickly. The challenge is there's just not that many more incandescent light bulbs to replace. So the power of its CO2 abatement has already well passed. And so you need to then start looking at many of these further out technologies that have tremendous opportunities. The challenge is they're currently very expensive. And so what we need to be doing from a CO2 abatement perspective, my view is that I think that where the sweet spot for what people are going to be able to willing to pay for CO2 abatement is probably really around the $40 or $50 a ton, which is essentially 3% of GDP of North American economies. And so essentially some of these technologies, which are still in the $400 to $500 a ton range, are essentially need technology and innovation on a scale that we have never seen before. And because the technology development is often unpredictable, that we need to be investing in all of these technologies. The reality is we can't electrify everything. We're going to be facing supply chain constraints and challenges in the future of the electrification. Permitting has become a major issue in the construction of new infrastructure in North America. Can we even build it at the pace that we need to be building it? And so we need all of these technologies. And again, my view that must be taking a technology agnostic view, which is where I think the oil and gas industry comes in. If you can't electrify everything, and the only rational solutions to getting rid of the emissions in the other half of the emissions problem are solutions such as carbon capture, hydrogen, biofuels, many of the technologies that are on this graph, the oil and gas industry is actually very well positioned with its skills in chemistry and its infrastructure design, subsurface design, that it has a lot of horsepower, investment capabilities, and skills that can be leveraged into the energy transition, which is where Avatar comes in. So Avatar is born from essentially the idea that the challenges to climate change and energy transition will come from inside the existing industry. I often say that the most complicated, slowest, and most expensive way to get to a net zero future is to go and invent a brand new energy system. The cheapest, fastest, and simplest way for us to get to a net zero future is to figure out how to use the existing trillions of dollars worth of global energy infrastructure to drive transitions into the future to get to a net zero process. So what we're doing is sort of three legs to the Avatar stool. The first leg is Avatar Ignite. This is a forum where hundreds of energy leaders inside the oil and gas industry come together and race across a 14-week curriculum guided by some of the world's most senior energy leaders and business leaders, and are tasked with ideating an energy technology that could have profound implications in the energy transition. Inside, they pitch their ideas inside the Avatar studio, and through our partnerships with the University of Calgary, U Alberta, as well as Texas A&M, they get a little bit of pre-seed capital and go and prototype it and see if it's there. But most importantly, find an industry use case inside the multi-trillion-dollar energy infrastructure system of today. And then, should the fundamental science work? Should there be clear IP? But most importantly, should there be industry appetite to deploy it? We will flip the IP and the developed content into a NewCo and seed it with our venture capital fund, as well as other sort of leading investors. But because the technologies have been born inside the industry capable of scaling them, they've been reaching market at record pace. One of the technologies I'll speak about in a bit went from concept to commercial pilot with a major midstream oil and gas company in less than 12 months. That's not only sort of breakneck speed from a tech dev perspective, it's also breakneck speed from an industry perspective. The reality is that because the energy industry generally consists of massive multi-billion-dollar companies that are very efficient at delivering what they're doing, they can sometimes be very difficult for startups to integrate with. So rather than, and I say this affectionately because I know how hard it is, but rather than sort of the garage inventor, trying to go and sell to the incumbent energy industry a concept, it's the incumbent energy industry telling us where the problem is in and of itself. To give you some ideas of the stats that we've accomplished thus far in the 3 short years we've been running Avatar, we've had over 1,200 industry professionals work through the program. We've opened up hubs in Calgary, Houston, Tulsa, and Kansas City. We formed a partnership with the X Prize Foundation on Elon Musk's $100 million carbon removal X Prize, of which we have sort of 2 finalists, and we have a portfolio now of 42 technologies being developed at various stages of development in sort of this new model for global industrial decarbonization, of working inside the industry that is capable of scaling it and using the existing energy system of today to build the energy system of tomorrow. We built the Canadian Energy Transition Centre, which is here in downtown Calgary, a major sort of oil producing capital of north of the world. We've housed more than 60 startups who have cumulatively raised in less than 2 years more than $500 million in venture capital. And we're being supported and funded by the vast majority of North American oil and gas companies with a combined market cap of over 1.5 trillion. Giving you an idea of the horsepower of the oil and gas industry now leading into the energy transition in a way that it hasn't before. I'll give you some specific technology case studies in terms of ways to be thinking about how the oil and gas industry can play in some of the technologies that we've sort of been having. MissionNet, which is that remote methane monitoring sensor technology, which they found an underutilized bandwidth called LoRaWAN that can send a small data signal across 20 kilometers, and it can pinpoint methane emissions to figure out where leaks are potentially coming from legacy oil and gas equipment, in allowing us to optimize our spend to shut the methane in. But it's also unlocked tremendous other use cases. The one they're developing right now is early wildfire detection. I'm not sure if you guys saw the smoke from Canada last year, but we have a massive forest that is uninhabited for thousands upon thousands of kilometers that is undergoing some major changes. And by using the remoteness of the Canadian oil and gas industry to unlock a new method for solutioning this. Splicing Connects just actually completed a pilot with a utility right now, figured out a way to do predictive analytics on when electrical connections fail. They partnered with Hitachi, who built out the digital sort of algorithm with them. Lockstep, which is an idea that I'm super excited about as well. They found a catalyst that can break methane into a formic acid and generate 70% of the heat as normal oxidation and combustion, but with 0 emissions. Think about where you could use that. Boilers, furnaces, OTSGs. The reality is, especially in Canada, when the temperature will swing to -40, for us to fully electrify the heating capabilities of our cities and remove it from natural gas, it's going to require a build out something along the lines of 8 times its current capacity of grid, because the amount of heat that's required for several days a year when the temperature drops to -40 degrees C. So these types of solutions of looking at natural gas or looking at the oil and gas industry in ways that does not produce emissions is potentially, a different way, and also going to be using the, billions of dollars worth of energy infrastructure that exists inside the country already, lessening the cost. CO2 brew, which is actually one of our furthest along technologies. They took an oil and gas carbon capture technology and put it on a brewery. When they make beer, at least in North America, when they ferment the wheat and the hops, they release the CO2 into the atmosphere and then go and buy food grade CO2, which is fossil, and use it to carbonate the beer. So net zero beer, if you will, or a circular beer. Not exactly going to solve the energy transition, but certainly a fan favorite here in Canada. And then Ethox, which is figured out a breakthrough method for the production of dimethyl ether, which can be used directly as a drop-in fuel for diesel, or one of those sort of e-fuels that could be out there. So that's sort of my high level thinking. Happy to answer any questions. You know, in short, if there's a few things that I want to be leaving you with, it is that the size, complexity, and scale of the energy transition is going to require a technology agnostic approach. Lowest cost per ton of CO2 abated will win. And let's use that as our sort of guiding principle. And that, you know, by working inside the industry that is capable of scaling it, we believe we can have an outsized impact on what is the towering and defining challenge of our generation, which is delivering abundant energy to a planet that must reach net zero emissions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kevin, for that very interesting presentation. I did have a follow-up question. So you used the phrase, we need to transition from the inside out, and we utilize, you know, the existing oil and gas infrastructure just because of the amount of money that is invested already. But I did want to know, from an environmental consideration and a social perspective, why should we lean towards, you know, using existing infrastructure over any other alternative? So what would be some of the environmental things or benefits and advantages of this option? Thank you.
So in terms of, you know, I think it's a lot different when you're having conversations about brownfield versus sort of greenfield. You know, for the world to reach net zero emissions, the developed world needs to increase its capital investment spending on energy infrastructure 3 times. The developed world needs to increase it by 7 times to sort of reach this. And so my point is any amount of capital that can be harnessed inside the energy transition is going to reduce the cost. You know, if you look at the numbers, you know, the numbers to reach net zero are somewhere between 80 trillion and 220 trillion. This is an absolutely staggering amount of capital. And if we can think about ways to use the existing infrastructure in brand new ways, you know, for example, instead of building out the electrical grid 8 times in Canada, just to electrify for the 10 days a year, we swing to -40 temperatures, and use the billions of dollars worth of natural gas pipelines in new non-emission ways, that is going to be make capital availability to the developing world, to other areas and jurisdictions where we need to either 3x or 7x the amount of investment that is in the space. We need to be looking at new business models and new partnership structures as governments around the world start reaching fiscal capacity, because the sort of reality of the energy transition is the size and complexity of this.
Thank you so much. I have a few more questions, but I will ask that in our dedicated question and answer session. Now I would like to welcome Michael, who is our next speaker. Michael Fellner is a senior project finance expert for renewable energy development with Get Invest, a European program that works to mobilize renewable energy investments in developing countries. He has accumulated over 20 years of experience in venture capital and infrastructure finance, and currently focuses his work on assisting renewable energy developers with reaching financial closure. He has been instrumental in the financial closure of the first industrial biogas plant in South Africa. He has also acted for the French Development Agency, AFD, assisting in the disbursement of 120 million euros in long-term loans to renewable energy and energy efficiency projects via 3 South African banks. Michael has conducted training workshops in project finance in Uganda, Tanzania, and Zambia for financial institutions and developers. He has also advised a multitude of renewable energy projects in Southern Africa through his long-standing affiliation with the Private Financing Advisory Network. He holds an MBA in finance from Erasmus University in the Netherlands. Thank you so much for coming on board, Michael. And I'm just making you presenter.
Okay, hold on. What am I doing wrong?
I think, yes, if you go on presentation mode.
All right. There we go.
And choose show my screen. Instead of show my PowerPoint, show my screen. Perfect. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just a quick introduction to the program that I'm a part of. It's called Get Invest. I'm a part of the Finance Access Advisory Service, which is basically involved in mobilizing investments. You can see the other services that we're providing as Get Invest as well, funded by the EU and Germany, Sweden, and the Netherlands, Norway, and Austria. Our function is to help project developers around Africa and the Caribbean and the Pacific to get their projects to financial close. Just move the slide, yeah. It's essentially a technical assistance facility that we provide. I think what's relevant is we get to see a lot of projects. We filter them out. We support a certain set, about 10% of the projects that we see applying to us, and we managed to get quite a number of them to financial close. I think you just heard a very technical presentation. We are sort of the group of people, there are 25 of us, that provide the financial services around making such technologies, such business models work, and trying to get it funded, get it accepted by financial institution across the world. These are the segments we're working in. I'm based in Johannesburg, so my main area of work is sub-Saharan Africa. But we're working with grid-connected power, so IPPs. We're working with mini grids, commercial and industrial. That's essentially an IPP that is a private-to-private setup. We're working with e-mobility clients, clean cooking, nowadays also storage and green hydrogen. And what we have found with mini grids, which is essentially energy access, is that they are best combined with some form of productive use program. So we're looking for sustainable projects across the continent and try and help them find investors from anywhere, but predominantly from Europe and the US, and get them to financial close. Some of the stories, just to give that some sort of flavor of what we have achieved. Here's one mini grid company based out of Lesotho. The idea of the company was to connect 10,000 households schools and health clinics. So Lesotho, importantly, is a country with a very low electrification rate. And we found or assisted in finding two major funds that helped them realize that achievement. And so we are currently in construction of these connections. This is an example of an IPP in Burundi, where we also assembled or helped assemble the financing. It was the first solar PV based independent power producer in Burundi, with quite a large capacity for that country. Here we have a solar home systems provider in Mozambique that we assisted to obtain funding, and they're setting these small systems that where you place the solar panels on the roof, and you've got power, sort of tier 3 power in the home. I didn't want to mention too many of those companies, otherwise it sounds like we're advertising. What are the challenges we are facing in Africa? I think some of the challenges are historical, and I've labeled them slightly in that format, historical challenges. Much of Africa has suffered through a kind of colonial legacy that of a very sort of singular purpose infrastructure development, where rural electrification was neglected, and that has created, and these are still there, disparities between access to electricity in the urban areas and in the rural areas. We've had a lot of conflict and political instability, and therefore a lack of focus on infrastructure development. Unlike the United States of America with 300 million people, we've got 600 million people that have not been electrified, but they live in 54 different countries, so it's not united, and it's double the problem that the United States had, or in terms of electrification. And we're supposed to do this in a very short space of time, and we're supposed to do this in a climate-friendly way. So that poses some sort of historical challenges. We've also seen that in the past 40 years, since most of these countries have abandoned their colonial masters, there has been a general underinvestment in infrastructure in the energy sector, and we feel that now. So transmission lines are not as strong as they are in Europe or in the US. They're not as widespread. And I think importantly, most African governments at this point are heavily indebted, and any new such infrastructure lands on top of an already existing debt pile. So those are the historical reasons why we're having difficulties in making this energy transition a just energy transition. Our focus is both on making sure that there is an increase in actual gigawatts in the on-grid gigawatts, as well as more people gaining access to energy. I think in the process we lost a lot of planning skills. We are seeing very few integrated planning, electricity planning programs in African countries. We see lots of reports written by advisors, but besides updating these annually, we don't see much implemented from the side of the governments. That points to a lack of capacity, a lack of commitment to move forward. A lot of the electricity sectors in African countries are structured still as monopolies. It's very difficult to bring in the private sector into these monopoly structures. And donor funds coming from various donor partners tend to be tied to the involvement of the private sector. I have a lot of sympathy for the people in the utilities in Africa, because historically it's not been their role to regulate the private sector, but with the increased participation of such private sector players, they need to now build up the capacity to regulate and work with the private sector. Just to show what we are talking about in terms of amounts required, and I think these are just estimates. It's between $40 and $55 billion to achieve these universal electrification targets. It always says by 2030, but I think it's unlikely that it will actually happen by 2030. And just to talk a little bit about what is making these projects take so long, whether they're energy access projects or IPP generation projects. I've highlighted in red some of the areas where we have seen projects take a long time. An initial area is the environmental impact, environmental and social impact assessment. And then further, it is structuring the deals, getting equity and debt to talk to each other, getting concessions or PPAs out of the governments, and then working with lenders, and finally finalizing these agreements. You can see on the slide all the other things that need to be done, so they can also take long. Discussions around land and land acquisition can be quite complicated in some African countries. But you see that from an ESG perspective, most of our projects do actually have to go and get an ESIA done, and I must admit that over the last year or so, this has become easier and faster as project developers become more familiar with it. Now to the solutions. Really, we need to start focusing on decentralized energy solutions. If we were to build a transmission grid that covers the whole of the continent, we would never get to, or we would not get to these targets of electrifying 600 million people in the next 10 to 20 years. The transmission grid would take up most of the money. So there are such solutions. They are actually, as Kevin mentioned, they are actually cheaper now than they ever were. So the cost of a connection in a mini grid is much cheaper than the cost of a grid extension. Using PV batteries and small amounts of diesel generators as backup, we can connect people with at around about $1,000 per connection, depending totally on how the business model is constructed. We've seen such connections being done, and they're usually being done through the private sector. It's not easy to do that as a government or as a utility. What the private sector needs, that's quite clear, is an enabling regulatory environment. So we see certain countries that are pro-private sector, if we can label that, or I think that they have accepted the private sector needs to be part of the solution. Kenya, Rwanda, South Africa being some of those, where the regulatory environment works really well, and where we can get projects to be bankable. Other countries where there's still a heavy involvement by the government in the electrification initiatives, like Mozambique, for instance, find it much more difficult to get their projects banked. So we need to, amongst the 54 countries, we need to find a way to get more favorable conditions for private sector investment and innovation, and to capacitate the regulators and make sure they understand the need and make it work. Yeah, lastly, I think it's well known what the number is that we need in order to reach these electrification targets, but it's often forgotten that these numbers are when they are being committed, they're not necessarily dispersed, and secondly, that they don't come as the right kind of money. We have to see that the infrastructure we're developing now is supposed to last for a generation, so it can't be treated like a venture capital fund where you're hoping to exit within a 7 or 10-year period. We need patient capital, we need concessionary finance, and we need people to understand that that's a requirement, and to help us, even if the term is blended finance, to help us structure subsidized financial packages to make these projects work. In my opinion, my humble opinion, the idea of getting large infrastructure projects off the ground at this point in time, which is a trend that people are advocating, is misplaced, because as I mentioned earlier, the governments are indebted. They have no way of paying for the electricity from large infrastructure projects. And unless donors want to both pay for the project and for the electricity that the project generates, we need not start. We need to find many small projects that these governments can fund, or where they can buy the electricity, or work directly with commercial industrial clients and residential clients. In summary, so there are challenges to getting 600 million people electrified in sub-Saharan Africa. We need to find the right funds. We need to build capacity amongst regulators and utilities. And we need to expand the arsenal of technologies that most African countries have. In the past, they've been using mostly hydroelectrical power, more recently coal-fired power, gas power, but very little of that. And now we need to, get them used to solar mini grids, the technology around there, small hydros, wind power, and make that work. And we must make room for decentralized solutions that are essentially driven by the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, for your presentation. I'm just going to ask one really quick follow-up question before we move into the question answer session. It's related to your presentation, and we have our audience member asking us, what do you mean by the statement, we can reach electrification targets much faster if we leave the transmission infrastructure for later? If you could explain a little bit more.
Yeah, so I think we were to focus on the transmission infrastructure, we would spend a lot of money on that. So mini grids are I would say, better, quicker solution. They can be built much faster, and we can connect those mini grids later on to a national transmission network. So that is a kind of strategy that would allow for a faster rollout of electrification. When we talk about mini grids, we're always talking about portfolios of mini grids, many concession areas, especially in rural areas that would get them electrified much faster.
Thank you. So you're suggesting mini grids as a stopgap because there is not existing transmission infrastructure.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you so much. And now I'm going to go into our dedicated question and answer session because we do have quite a few questions. And thank you, Kevin, for joining us. Why don't we start with you, Kevin? So can you please better define, you use the term technology agnostic, can you please better define what that means?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Lowest cost of CO2 per ton abated is sort of what I mean, right? Is that because technology development pathways are sometimes unpredictable, that the focus needs to be on lowest cost per ton of CO2 abated to ensure that we're driving the greatest efficiencies in that. And so that the implications of that are both from an investment as well as from a public policy landscape, rather than sort of government or investment just picking one technology, convinced that that is going to be the winner. We need to be focusing an investment in a policy portfolio that looks at lowest cost per ton of CO2 abated and potential is what I mean by that, as opposed to picking a technology and saying that's the one that's going to solve it, because the size of the complexity of the energy transition is so large. We need all.
Okay. Thank you. Michael, my next question is for you. So you have mentioned working in different parts in Africa. I wanted to know, how was your experience with the environmental considerations? Was there, I think you mentioned the ESIAs have become easier in the last few years. What has changed? Why? And if something has changed, what were the challenges before? If you could tell us a little bit more about that. Thank you.
I think the challenge before was one of capacity on both sides. The developers didn't really understand why they needed to do ESIs, and the government, once they received those, the regulatory authorities didn't know what to do with them. So what we find now is that there are essentially consultants being used on both sides. One to draft the ESIA, to go through the whole process of drafting it, the whole process of stakeholder engagement, etc. And then on the other side, on the regulator side, again, a consultancy working to evaluate what was done. So once that recognition is there and the process is understood, and it's understood that it will take a while to get that done on a project by project basis, then both parties start working that way. So, but we find in each country, if they haven't done it before, it takes a long time to get them moving. And we can assist. That's the role of Get Invest. We can assist the developer, but we also have ways of making sure that we can assist the country or the regulator with appointing consultants and transferring knowledge. It's capacity building on both sides that makes that work. But obviously, it takes a long time. And if you look at 54 countries and making that kind of doing this kind of work in various countries, big and small, Nigeria and Sierra Leone, etc. It can get quite complex. Obviously, also on the legal side, you have the same problem, that the regulators are not aware of the need for bankable concessions, not necessarily aware of it. So we need to provide legal assistance to make them aware of it, and that, it just takes time. That's all. But we want to rush this. That's the essence. So when we want to rush this, we need to work with the existing infrastructure, the existing capacities, and just supplement where we can.
I'm going to ask just a follow-up because it's closely related to what I just asked. How has your experience been working or interacting with the local community, and do they have any concerns regarding the environmental impacts of any infrastructural developments? Is that a consideration at all, or is it very much just the regulatory side?
I think the local community becomes a big deal if you're doing something like a hydropower dam or something like that. Then you're really disrupting. But if you are providing a mini grid that is a small array of PV panels, a powerhouse, and grid connection to every home, they're benefiting. They're the beneficiaries. We find that that's actually very easy to sell to them, and by the time you arrive, you should be in a position to already start building, which is usually not the case. You arrive, you do the consultations, and then you need to find your funding, and then 6 months later or a year and a half later, you come back to build. So it's more a case of creating expectations and then not fulfilling them fast enough than it is a case of having any issues in the mini grid sector. Everybody wants to be electrified. We haven't found, what was the terminology? We haven't found an electron that was sold that anybody wanted to give back at any point. So electrification is a human right. It's just we have 600 million people here without access to electricity. So they're looking forward to it. The faster we can get there, the better.
Thank you. Over to you, Kevin. When you incubate innovation ideas, to what extent do you consider environmental externalities as part of the process from the idea stage, especially during the avatar, I think, ignite phase? Yeah.
Emissions reductions is the sort of primary goal. Is any of the concepts and technologies get evaluated against their emissions reduction intensity, as well as the potential investment landscape that the technology could be sort of deployed against. Once it sort of gets into the sort of project phase, a lot of the sort of lab work that we're doing and research that we're doing, we have a line of sight on the project deployment inside Canada, especially Indigenous consultation as an engagement as a massive undertaking for us to ensure local and Indigenous sort of buy-in, and through our partnerships and relationships with a number of Canadian Indigenous First Nations, the sort of social considerations of it are done. But inside the early stages, it's how much can we potentially reduce emissions, and what are going to be the long-term economics or a plausible long-term economics on the plate to sort of be able to get there. But those would be our two guiding principles from the very beginning.
Okay, thank you. And so, Michael, now back to you. When you are considering a project, whether that's like mini grids, what are the potential social and environmental impacts that you consider when you're establishing, or any other renewable energy project that you've been involved in?
So, well, with wind projects, we find that there's much concern about environmental impacts around noise, around shade, around birds. Those all have to be done. So wind projects in particular, we find that the ESIA takes long, is very thorough, and has to be done, multidimensional. While, as I mentioned before, on the mini grid side, your small solar mini grid tends to have a very simple ESIA. So yeah, so wind projects, it gets complicated. I did want to mention that, with wind projects, you find there are some externalities that make it interesting, because in order to put up a set of wind turbines in any given place, you most likely have to do some road construction as well, because the turbines are of a certain length, and you need to make sure that you don't have any harsh corners, and there is usually no road where you will be putting the wind turbine. So what we find is, during the development stage, we find people buying properties where the road should be built, in order to then gain from the opportunity that we need to resettle them as part of the environmental impact or management program. So that has happened. That is sort of an occurrence that you have to budget for on wind projects. But those it doesn't happen on solar projects. You buy the land on solar projects, or you lease it. You don't have to build roads necessarily. But yeah, I mean, those are the big ones. I don't think that in the type of renewable projects that we get involved in, that we find much concern from the stakeholders and from the communities. It's very little.
So that's very interesting, because there is you have to strike that balance of, they do know that it's something that will benefit from, but there is this element of being opportunistic where possible. Okay, I think over to you, Kevin. I had a question. Do you think in certain situations decommissioning would be the better alternative? Why are you so pro repurposing?
Oh yeah, in some situations, decommissioning is going to definitely be the right option. My sort of argument is that there's you sort of even heard it from Michael, the cost of building out a full transmission system inside the continent of Africa versus sort of deploying an existing or a microgrid solution is the far more advantageous solution. Whatever is the lowest cost of ton per CO2 abated while delivering the energy system of today is the route that we need to be going at. The point I would probably try and take, make a little more fine then, is the skills and talent and capital and sometimes assets inside the oil and gas industry will have a meaningful and outsized impact on the energy transition. Concrete, for example, cement, any of the hard to abate sectors, fertilizers. The vast majority of fertilizer currently on the planet is made right now from natural gas and natural gas liquids. How can we decarbonize that using carbon capture technologies, green and blue hydrogen technologies inside of those things? Is that you have to be looking at it from where's the technology? How can we get the tons of CO2 down? And where there's an asset that is potentially relevant inside this approach, it needs to be fully sort of considered. And just decommissioning it, if that's sort of the case, is one solution, but it's one of many solutions.
Thank you. Michael, in your presentation, you used the term enabling regulatory frameworks, and you gave examples of some countries that were enabling and some that were more restrictive. Are there some characteristics that would make one country more enabling versus restrictive? And if you could tell us a little bit more as to what you look for.
Yeah, a lot of countries don't actually have regulation for mini grids. So if you walk into a country like that and you want to build a mini grid, your funders will say, well, what's stopping the national utility from just nationalizing your mini grid? So you need to have a concession, you need to have an agreement with the government that you are allowed to build a mini grid. You need to have exclusivity. I mean, not that it's a particularly competitive area. As I mentioned, 600 million people need to be electrified. So hardly do you find people competing about one community. But you need to have all those assurances in order to attract funding. What happens if the grid arrives? Will they buy the mini grid infrastructure and offer grid or national tariffs? What happens around the tariff? Is it a cost-reflective tariff for the mini grid, or is there a requirement that you use the national tariff, which is generally a subsidized tariff and much lower? So it's a political tariff, if you want. Those are the regulations that and I haven't mentioned them all, that one needs to have, and we find certain countries have them, have worked on them, have published them, and then bankers or financial institutions feel secure about investing in mini grids in those countries. If they haven't, there are many templates now available, but it's a nascent industry, the mini grid sector. So you know, not everybody has read everything, I find. So, but the information is available. The regulatory framework that is sort of standardized now has been made available, can be copied from one country to the next, and then you know the investment can happen. Certainly, I think an additional component is the subsidization schemes that we've also now realized that subsidization needs to happen for mini grids, and at a reasonable level, and then our programs in place for such subsidization. They're just not Africa-wide programs that wherever you build a mini grid, you can quickly get your subsidy. It's not that simple. They're very country specific, and you need to apply and you need to get through a 6 months due diligence and so on. So it's more complex than we would wish it to be.
Thank you. Kevin, I did want to now ask you about in what ways can the technological innovation be leveraged by stakeholders to not only reduce emissions but also create new employment opportunities, and you know, enhance skills in the renewable energy sector. So what are your thoughts on that?
Skill development, I think, is absolutely critical in the future that we live in. You know, we now live in a world of exponential technology change, and so whatever that means is that the speed that technology is changing at right now, it's going to only increase. And so I think the world is entering a period where we need to commit ourselves to essentially a lifelong journey of education, and that will create new employment opportunities as we move through a massive transformation. Artificial intelligence is at a point, you know, the amount of capital that the artificial intelligence industry has raised in the last year and a half is absolutely staggering. It is going to transform the way we do work in literally every single sector. And so I don't think artificial intelligence is going to take everybody's job. but I think people that know how to use artificial intelligence will take people who don't know how to use artificial intelligence as jobs. And so building out and finding forums like Avatar, like this webinar series, is committing oneself to a period of sort of lifelong learning and work integrated learning to ensure that you're staying up to speed with the biggest advancements in technologies, to ensure that whatever domain you're working in is relevant in sort of the labor market as it sort of evolves. That would be sort of my high level thinking on how to ensure that as the world changes technologically, we're all and in the energy transition, people aren't sort of left behind and are committing themselves to constantly finding new skills and new values so they can contribute in what is undoubtedly going to be a more complex and technologically advanced world.
Thank you. Thank you, and I think it's really interesting that you both are bringing perspectives from very different parts of the world, and your experiences are very dissimilar. So I do have a question for the both of you, which is that if there was one misconception about the term energy transition, what do you think it is? And yeah, how would you address that?
If there was one misconception, I always struggle with the term just, because we're calling it a just energy transition, and in sub-Saharan Africa, where really the large percentage of people that we are trying to electrify have never had an electrical connection, and we're talking about a transition from firewood or kerosene or diesel to something that now finally works 24/7 and gives them the ability to get to the same starting block as Europe and the United States have been for a very long time. That just seems to be focused on switching away from emissions, and our just is focused on giving people a first step into this world where you can use appliances. So it's a kind of different way of interpreting the just. It's a different space we're working in.
Kevin, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would say those are really interesting thoughts from Michael, but I would say that the biggest conception is that it's an energy source transition as opposed to an emissions transition. If we think about it today, we use more oil, more gas, more wind, more solar, more hydro, more nuclear than at any other previous point in history, except for tomorrow. And so by focusing on the emissions as opposed to necessarily the energy source, it becomes a lot more manageable and a lot more sort of inclusive to multiple sort of jurisdictions and a lot more reliable. So I think that's, to me, that's one of the biggest misconceptions about the energy transition, is that what are we transitioning from? And it's emissions is the one thing that everyone can sort of agree on, as opposed to necessarily a primary energy source. And that, to me, makes it a lot easier and solvable.
Yes, I think I asked that question just to cover the spectrum of experiences, and that yes, we are considering still firewood in such a large part of the world versus the innovation that's happening in some of the examples that you mentioned. So even though the term energy transition is supposed to be all inclusive, they're at very different stages to actually making that happen. So just to wrap up, I probably have one or two last questions. In what ways do you think that governments and industry leaders can collaborate to navigate the complexities of integrating new technologies into existing infrastructure systems? Kevin, you can if you want to.
Yeah, from a sort of Western or North American perspective, the big area right now is permitting reform. the average long distance electricity transmission line that crosses a border in North America requires 13,000 permits. You know, as we go to electrify everything, like that is a major barrier in our ability to sort of be able to construct anything. You know, that is a big area that government and private industry, and no one from private industry is calling for lower regulatory standards or scrutiny. It's just the complexity of the permitting and approval process to build any linear infrastructure, any type of infrastructure in North America is going to be a challenge. You know, Dan Jurgen from IHS Sierra said, you know, the dreams of the energy transition will crash on the shores of regulatory structure. That is a major issue that actually we have any hope of reaching our net zero commitments. We have to go and build stuff, and we need to be looking at a pretty significant and serious way of looking at that. The second piece of the puzzle I would maybe sort of point at is that you know, we need an answer to investment in energy technologies that is something other than a government like a government grant. You know, we need to be looking at means of really bringing in the right type of capital. There's a lot of venture capital that's available. There's a lot of project financing that's available. But so many of these projects that are about to get built, we need another answer than just a government grant to be able to get these projects actually going. And I think that's where government and private industry could look at a lot of these major multi-billion-dollar projects that need to get built on how we actually finance and fund these things. So yeah, permitting reform and actually how we get the investment into the projects to build them.
Thank you. Michael, did you have an answer to that question, or?
You know, it's interesting because we're operating from two different sides of the spectrum here, and my answers are exactly the same. So we need, I call it regulatory reform. We need proper regulation, so that should result in less permitting, less a smoother regulatory environment. We need the right kind of money to implement projects in Africa, and here in particular, we don't need VC money. We need patient capital. We need money that has a tenure of 20 years and low concessional rates, and where the investors can wait for their returns. So, and lastly, we need capacity. So we need people with skills that work together, both in government and the private sector, that understand each other's problems and that want to work on behalf and for the beneficiaries that ultimately should receive the energy access and should benefit from a cleaner environment. So if we have those three components, I think we can get this done. But if any one of them is missing, then we might be sitting in an endless loop of trying to get the funding that doesn't arrive, or we're in these endless regulatory loops, or we just find ourselves with a set of people trying to do something that they don't understand and don't have the capacity to do. So it's all those three components that need to work together, in my opinion.
Thank you. So it seems like regardless of what side of the spectrum you fall on, you need the regulatory, the finance, as well as the energy sector to work in tandem. Do either of you have any closing, any final thoughts that you would like to share before I move towards closing?
I would just say it actually been fascinating looking at the parallels between you know, the African and North American continents on the energy transition, and But what I would say is I think that this is, despite the size and complexity and scope of this, the energy transition is the most exciting space to be working in the future. And good luck with whatever your journey on is. It's an exciting space. Thanks for welcoming me.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much,
I can
Kevin.
just repeat that.
Thank you so much for joining us, for your time, for being Kevin, for being up at 6 in the morning to make this. It's been such an interesting discussion, and also thank you to our audience who've asked such insightful, interesting questions. We haven't been able to get to all of them. But before I wrap up, I just wanted to let everyone know that this is a recorded webinar and the video will be uploaded. I'm going to send everyone who attended today an email which will include our feedback survey. If you complete our feedback survey, you will receive a certificate of participation within 10 days after completing it. In the same email, you will also receive the link to this video as well as the presentations that both our panelists have shared today. Since you have attended this session, you will now receive our monthly newsletter. My colleague Marlene is also going to send you the link to join our LinkedIn. So please stay connected with us. It's going to be on the chat. Our next session will be in July of next month, and it's going to be focusing on bridging the gap. Speaks about women, gender, and labor considerations in the energy transition. So we really hope that more of you can join us then. Thank you so much for following along, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.